I feel you all know me and everyone has to get to flights, and I'm super excited to talk about this, so let's just jump right into it. So thanks so much to the ADA again for inviting me back to keep talking about this, which is a project that I love. It's so interesting. And now we are launching our report of our nationwide library survey on e-lending. So most of you here are familiar with this project. It's a linkage bringing together terrific library partners from within Australia and also all around the world with this very good-looking team of researchers across law and data science and social research. And we have been working together for a few years now to gather all kinds of new data about how library e-lending is actually working in practice. We've previously conducted a whole bunch of studies. There's the focused Australian study, which compares availability of ebooks for lending across 5 local aggregators here, an international equivalent that looks at the availability of those same books across 5 different countries, but from a single aggregator. Our large-scale international study where we looked at almost 100,000 books to compare how they were being priced and licensed in different countries and patterns about who controlled those books. And a bestseller study in which we measured how long it took for ebooks at a particular point in time to become available for e-lending in libraries. And in progress as well, we have a publisher study where we are interviewing publishers to understand their perspectives on how everything works and how and why they make the decisions that they do about e-lending, which I'm going to mention again right at the very end. And of course, we have all of our data from the completed studies available on our website. I hope you've been there. I hope you have played with our very cool interactive dashboards. And if you haven't, you should do that, but not until I finish talking. So do definitely check that out. So we started this project because we had really serious concerns about the availability and accessibility of books for e-lending, digital lending within libraries. And now, of course, we regulate ebooks really differently to the way we regulate physical books. Libraries have always been able to buy and lend physical books without needing anybody's permission, but with ebooks it's different. Buying and lending ebooks involves the making of copies and transmissions, and that means we do need the publisher's permission. And publishers have been exercising those new rights over ebooks in a whole bunch of different ways. And what we wanted to understand is exactly how that was playing out and how that impacts public libraries' abilities to fulfill their public interest missions. Now, over time, it's 4 years, I think, or maybe even 5 years since this was an apple in our eye. At that time, we were concerned, but what's happened is in the last year or two, we've seen some really troubling developments that makes this more important than ever. So we see that 4 of the big 5 publishers have shifted to what we call exploding licenses. Those are time-limited licenses. So the library will have access to a title. They can lend it out to one person at a time for usually 36 times or 2 years, whichever comes first. And once that clock stops ticking and the time runs out, the book is deleted from their collections, even if nobody ever borrowed it at all. Now, the ones shifting to exploding licenses include Hachette, but that at least doesn't bother us. It doesn't make us any worse off because Hachette still refuses to license any books to libraries in Australia or any other Commonwealth country on any terms whatsoever. And that's the world's 3rd largest trade and educational publisher. But we also see Macmillan has reintroduced embargoes on books. The bestseller study we did showed that publishers were very willing to make their new books available to libraries, appreciating the discoverability that they provided and perhaps understanding the equity issues about making that kind of content available to people that might not be able to purchase it in the marketplace. But embargoes have come back thanks to Overdrive, and they've made that decision quoting data that they have not made available and which Overdrive, who's the leading aggregator in the world, the Overdrive CEO says that data simply can't be right because it doesn't match anything that they've got on their end. And we're also seeing Amazon whispering into publishers' ears about e-lending being bad for them and their authors. Now, Amazon obviously has an interest in being the only supplier of books. In the Amazon dystopia, there are no public libraries. We just have the Kindle Unlimited subscription service that everybody pays for, and if you're a poor person, you get some vouchers for some free books. So why do we need libraries anymore? That's really what they're aiming for and the world they would like to see. So they're perhaps not a friend to any of us here. But we keep hearing that these whispers are being taken to heart by publishers and they're really concerning them. And we're going to come back again at the end to why that might be. So again, there's no public data to support Amazon's claims. And indeed, they're contradicting the evidence that has been publicly made available about the relationship between library access to books and book sales. And so all of this makes open and transparent and rigorous data and evidence more timely and important than ever. So I'm delighted to be here to be able to launch our report. It's a world-first report from a nationwide survey that we ran just over a year ago. And the reason it took us that amount of time to process this data is because we got extraordinarily generous and thoughtful responses that really humbled us from the library communities. So many committed librarians took time out of their busy, very busy work schedules. We could see in the responses how long the libraries spent filling out this survey, and it was just really generous. So we've had a lot of really rich data to work with. And I want to say all of our research is conducted independently, and sometimes our findings go against common beliefs in the library sector about how things are working, or maybe not everybody likes the findings that we receive. But I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge our wonderful partners and the wonderful library communities that have just shown such an open-mindedness in listening to the evidence, looking at it, evaluating it for themselves to see what they think it's worth, and very often changing their minds. And you don't always get that, so thank you so much. All right, now let me jump into the results. What we wanted to understand with this survey was how publisher licensing practices were impacting library decisions about which books to add to their collections. And we also wanted to understand the trade-offs that libraries were making in balancing their scarce resources and their community's diverse needs in the e-lending space. So, we were really happy with the response rate. There are a number of state or territory-wide consortia, as you see. We heard from all of those: Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, the ACT, and the Northern Territory. And then some libraries in those regions also top up the collection separately, and we heard from 18 of those individual libraries as well. We heard from, then of course there's lots of states where the libraries are divided up into public council areas or smaller consortia. We heard from 48% of Queensland libraries, 51% of New South Wales libraries, and 83% of Victorian libraries, so yay for my home state, thank you so much. But Ross tells me 50% is about right for a response rate from New South Wales, so I won't feel too hurt about that. But overall, you can see this is a really terrific response rate. And I just want to mention, just when you're thinking, when I'm talking about the numerical results here, obviously, these responses represent really different geographical areas and really different numbers of readers. It was impossible to normalize for that in this format. And so when I talk about what percentage of libraries said what, I want you to just bear in mind that sometimes we're talking about a library that represents an enormous place, and sometimes we might be talking about a little regional library, and think less about those numbers and more about the trends and what we're getting from that. So we began by asking libraries which platforms they use for e-lending, how many they use, and about 2/3 used more than one. The median was 2, and there were 3 libraries that were managing 4 separate platforms. And so you won't be surprised to know that platform fees, which can easily run to tens of thousands of dollars a year per platform, were one of the really big concerns that libraries made. So if we've got these platform fees, why is it that libraries contract with more than one aggregator? It's because libraries see public demand for books as the most important factor in deciding whether to purchase titles. And that came out really consistently through responses to a whole bunch of the questions that we asked. So here's one example. We asked libraries to rank each of these factors in order of importance. So known demand, anticipated demand. Known demand might be customer requests and holds for books. Anticipated demand, pre-release buzz, or maybe it's a well-known author, or it's part of a series that's gone very well before. We've got curation factors as well, whether the library sees it as important to hold the book independent of demand for it, the price, and the license type. And what we saw is that known and anticipated demand were by far the most highly ranked factors over all of those other considerations. We saw the importance of demand again when we asked libraries whether they would purchase titles with high demand, regardless of unattractive pricing. And 38% just gave a flat yes. A further 47% said it depends, but then gave us further explanation to suggest that they often felt that they didn't really have a choice. If their readers wanted that book and that book was available, then libraries felt that it was part of their mission to do everything that they could to deliver access to that book. And just 14% said a flat no. And there was a real sense of frustration in the responses to these questions. And one of the respondents told us, remaining relevant means that we're a slave to demand-driven purchasing. Don't tell the publisher. I hope that was rhetorical because we've put this on the front page of the report and I think they're going to find out. But the thing is, it's really important for us all to understand this environment that we're working in. Libraries also told us that licensing and pricing models are negatively impacting the breadth and the depth of their collections. And one library told us, for example, some titles just move at a slower pace than the current models would allow. So things like Australian poetry. And when publishers make that kind of title available only on those time-limited exploding licenses, libraries are weighing up whether they do think that they'll circulate enough to justify the cost. And they're often concluding that even if they think it's important to hold that book in their collection because it's by an Australian author, that it's culturally important, they're often concluding that they just can't add it, that their very precious collection dollars need to be allocated somewhere less risky. And that's not at all because libraries see their role as just providing access to the newest and shiniest bestsellers, right? That's not it at all, right? Elsewhere in their answers, they emphasize to us just how important they see their curation role to be. They want to hold Australian books and older literary prize winners, older books in their collections ongoing. Right? And they told us it was more important to them to hold older Australian bestsellers than new international bestsellers. That's how important they see the curation role to be. But again, those exploding licenses often make it infeasible for them to actually fulfill that mission. So we asked what kinds of books libraries would be more or less likely to buy on those exploding licenses. And they told us they're more likely to support known Australian authors than known international authors. they're more likely to support, the known Australians. They're less likely to buy books by debut authors, books by writers published outside of the Big Five, and older titles. So again, you can see these are the ones that are likely to have less demand, and so they're the ones that libraries feel are too risky to add to their collections as often as they would like to when they're made available on those terms. So that kind of term, at least in some cases, seems to actually be working against books by some publishers and some authors, and results in the collection being tilted to other kinds of books. We also asked libraries for their wish lists, and they strongly communicated their desire for multiple license types and price points. One told us that uniform licensing models, where you just have a take it or leave it one option, one price, can lead to a shallow collection that favors stuff that only moves in the short term rather than the long term, and may not have been borrowed in the license period. So again, you're seeing here the concern about those exploding licenses that can expire before the libraries have really had or library patrons have really had a chance to read those books. Now, that desire for multiple license types and options is really too bad, because as our previous research has demonstrated, e-lending licensing is based on a one-size-fits-all model. Libraries are only very rarely offered a choice of license. Our respondents told us as well that they were really interested in trying out per loan licenses and simultaneous use licenses. And these were the biggest things in the wish list. These models are finally starting to become a little bit more common. Some publishers are dipping a toe in to try them out, but they are still relatively rare in the Australian market. But libraries told us if they could have access to per loan licenses, they would hold more of those risky titles, the ones with uncertain demand, those less popular works, those classic titles. They told us it would reduce the penalty of poor purchase decisions. They were interested in making sure that the money that they spent on the collection went as closely as they could to the books and the publishers and the authors of the books that were actually circulating, right? Rather than something that just sort of sat there, was never touched, and was deleted after 2 years. And they also said it would help serve smaller populations. So, for example, in rural libraries. Another thing we asked about was about e-collections in languages other than English. Because, of course, one of the wonderful things about ebooks is that they do have that potential to reach disenfranchised populations, including those that aren't from the dominant language. But libraries reported they have relatively few books to serve non-English speaking populations. So we see that 68% of the respondents said they had none at all, and 25% said just a little. And the most we got was that 7% of libraries admitted to having a moderate amount, but nobody claimed more than that. And also really interesting was our finding that very few libraries were actively working to address that. And what they told us about was this negative loop that they'd ended up in. And the way it works is this. It's really difficult to get access to quality books in a range of other languages. So they didn't buy many. That meant they were pretty unattractive to LOTE borrowers, right? This is a really shallow collection, nothing much to see there. So there was no one around to actually borrow those books. Because of that, the LOTE titles didn't circulate, and so libraries didn't add to those collections or repurchase the titles once the license expired if they were the exploding licenses. And the end result of this unhappy loop is that it suggests there's no demand, and so there's no real investment being put into making more foreign language books available. So there we are on that. The final finding I want to mention concerns the digital divide. And even today, probably none of you will be surprised to hear that libraries report real challenges serving rural and remote communities and vulnerable populations. Not everybody has a suitable, we were hearing before, 6 internet-supported devices, internet-enabled devices, mum, the CIO who's making sure everything's charged. Not everyone has any of that. Not everyone has an internet connection. We hear there's still 14% of Australians without broadband. And indeed, in some parts of this vast country, there are still places where we struggle to keep the lights on. So we heard that loud and clear, that often in rural and remote areas, the technology is not reliable and it's expensive, so people prefer to borrow print resources because it's in their hands without relying on faulty technology. All right, so there is heaps more in the actual report, which I will leave you to read, but I just wanted to give you these teasers. What we're really seeing from all this is an Australian library community that is deeply committed to e-lending as a better way of serving their readers and building the reading community, but that there's real problems with the way the market is working at the moment. We see this demand-driven, forced demand-driven culture means there's a lot of unmet demand because collections budgets are going to certain material. And we see that it has clear implications for libraries' other important missions, like ensuring access to important cultural content and serving non-English speaking communities and those that are digitally excluded. Our final piece of work, I just want to mention, already commenced interviewing publishers about how and why they make the decisions that they do. This is the final bit of the puzzle before we commence our last task, which is making the legal and policy and practice reform recommendations on the basis of all of this evidence. And there are some really quite astonishing discoveries already coming out of this, and I can't resist telling you about just one of them. One of them is that, I told you publishers are a bit scared because Amazon's whispering in their ears about e-lending being bad for their readers. What we've discovered, and what comes as news to libraries as well, is that the publishers can't actually get any data on how often these books are being lent. So in their minds, they might think that it's thousands and thousands of times, and this is hugely interfering with their primary markets for sale. But in fact, we've developed a checkouts database, and we've looked at this, and the median number of times any ebook is actually lent out is 13. Right, so that's a really important piece of information, and it suggests that when we bring all of this together and we have a roundtable between publishers and libraries, we can actually perhaps implement some reforms to practice that don't even require legislative intervention and give both publishers and libraries more of what they want. All right, I've gone as quickly as I can because I know we're over time, but I'm going to consider this report launched. Please do read it and share it and talk about it and tweet about it and have a think about what it means for the future of lending in libraries. Thanks.